Hello, everybody. Got it, recording. Hello, everybody, as you join us today on what in Dublin is a beautiful sunny day. I've come in from the garden. I've built a bird table, I don't mind admitting, and we are all together for another session of Behavioural Science Club. As you all join us, the usual thing, we ask you if you have the bandwidth to turn on your camera so that we can see your faces as you join us, to keep yourselves muted for the first half of the conversation. And today, as you join us, we are delighted to have with us today Kenneth Cukier and Viktor Mayer-Schönberger, and they are the authors, along with Frances de Véricourt, of this book that we're talking about today, Framers. Kenneth is the senior editor at The Economist, and Viktor is a professor of internet governance at Oxford University. The third author, Frances de Véricourt, is a professor of management science at the European School of Management and Technology. And in fact, the book was chosen for the Financial Times Summer Books of 2021. So that's a super list to have got onto. So the book, for those of you who haven't yet seen it, is it's about our human advantage, our unique ability of framing. And framing is creating a mental model and seeing patterns, making sense. And this is something that the authors make very clear at the outset that computers can't do. And the book is how to turn this ability into a skill and to solve our challenges. They tell us rather controversially that thinking outside the box is useless. We're always in a frame. There's super stories in the book. It's just bang on with fantastic stories. One that's just particularly stuck in my mind is talking about how Spotify reframed music as an experience. These are the examples they give of reframing. COVID framed as a seasonal flu equals disaster, but framed as New Zealand did as SARS, great success in managing. So these are examples of framing, revolutionizing how we think about our future. And very important for us to point out at the outset, so many of you joining us are behavioral science specialists, and we're not talking about framing in the same way as we do with the social sciences. And at this point, I'm just going to read something from the book. Let's just make this clear from the outset. The term framing is well established in social sciences. Though we share the same term, the meaning here is somewhat different. Not how something is positioned, but a deliberate act of harnessing mental models to elicit options prior to making a decision. So Kenneth and Viktor, I don't know which of the two of you want to join us first, but just for all of our members, they probably haven't read the book as we have. I've given a few examples, but Kenneth, maybe you first. Give people who've joined us today the sort of a gist of what the book is about.
Sure, absolutely. So first, thank you very much for having us. We're really grateful that we can be here today and that we can talk about the book and share our passion for this topic with you and have a conversation, because we'd like to learn from you as well. What is the book about? The book is about mental models. The book is about the power of mental models and the way in which we can use this basic feature of cognition into a tool or a cognitive muscle for us to make better decisions, both as an individual, as organizations, and as a society. But to do that, we need to realize that it exists, it's something special. And on one side of us, in the debate outside of here, we have people who believe that human decision-making is so flawed that in fact, we need to trust algorithms and AI and data in order to make better decisions. Now, AI and data can help us make good decisions, but it can't do all that human beings need to do. And we can talk about why that is the case, that we still need framing. On the other side, there's a debate going on in society to say that we should just give up on this project. And in fact, there's an authenticity in sort of speaking from the gut and from the sort of the sense of doing away with facts and and introspection altogether, and just making decisions out of pure sort of rightness of purpose. And that might be the populist cause and others. And there too, we say that that leads to disaster. So between this tension in society, between what we call the emotionalists and the hyper-rationalists, we situate this cognitive ability of human framing that we've always had, that we have from childhood, that we can get better at, and we can actually use to improve the lot of humankind.
That's fantastic, Ken. The dichotomy of rationalists versus the emotionalists. Viktor, maybe you just sort of pad that out a little bit with a few examples of maybe a couple of stories from the book that illustrate how framing has been used successfully.
Of course, very happy to do that. So first of all, of course, it matters which frame one takes. If you are thinking about pandemics and how you look at pandemics and what decisions you take from pandemics, you can look at the current pandemic, COVID-19, or you can look at a previous one. There is a very interesting story about an earlier pandemic, also very virulent, dangerous in Africa. And there were two institutions, WHO and the Médecins Sans Frontières, and they had the same data, but had different frames to look at the problem. One had a frame that emphasized sort of historical comparison, if you want time, and the other had a frame that emphasized space and relations in space, where basically infections had happened and how they had spread. And depending on the different frames that they had, they came up with different predictions about whether the pandemic would spread or not. Importantly, initially WHO won the battle, won the argument, and said, we don't need to do much. This is not a major outbreak. It will eventually die down. But then it didn't. In fact, it mushroomed, and Médecins Sans Frontières stepped in and called for drastic actions, much like lockdown, even worse than that. And that actually then stamped out the pandemic, but unfortunately, of course, at a significant human cost. So you see immediately that which frame you take has huge repercussions, not only on what you see, but what decisions you make in order to react to it. It's important to emphasize that they had exactly the same data, but the mental model that they used, of course, made the difference. However, having said all of this, here is the important wrinkle, or if you want, the important core argument. A lot of people then come in and have come in over the past decade or two and say, look, that's why we humans have to pick the frame, the right frame. And if we don't have the right frame, we need to pick a different frame, that is reframe. And so a lot of people jump around and throw their frame out and jump to a different frame and all that. In the book, we argue that reframing is a useful strategy, but it's also an incredibly risky strategy. And oftentimes, and this is quite counterintuitive at first, oftentimes it's actually more useful and effective to stay within the frame you have and to play around with it. And in the book, we make the argument that there are 3 C's that help us do that. We call them causality, counterfactuals, and constraints. Causality basically means that we think in causal templates. Counterfactuals means that we humans are able to not only see the world as it is, but as what it can be, to ask what-if questions and to play the game of life a couple of moves ahead in our mind in order to pick the right decision and imagine the consequences that are coming from that decision. The way we come up with these counterfactuals is by constraining or loosening our imagination. And that is a very powerful mechanism. I'll just want to wrap it up here, and sorry to take so long, by suggesting that the Wright brothers, who came up with powered flight, weren't reframers. They didn't throw away the mental model of the laws of physics. In fact, they stayed within it and they played around with the constraint, and that enabled them to build the Wright Flyer and to take off into air.
Great examples. Thanks so much, Viktor. And of course, Kenneth, as Viktor was saying, which frame we choose is important. And once we're in a frame, it can be quite difficult to get out of it. I'm thinking of frames of our past, you know, a racist frame, for example, and then the way in which it can take a long time to come out of that frame. Is that a danger with frames, Kenneth?
Well, yeah, of course it is. I mean, we see that in the world today with people who are wedded to one frame versus another, and if the frame is faulty, it doesn't fit the situation. That's a problem. Now, behind, for example, is the idea.
Do you want to jump in there, Viktor? I think Kenneth's frozen a little bit there.
Yes, I think this must be a broadband frame problem. There he is back again.
Kenneth might be back with us.
Sorry, I'm hearing you all perfectly, but I apologize. Well, let me start again. If this happens again, I'll find a solution. I don't know what, but we'll see. Hopefully the broadband frame, as Viktor put it, will last. The gods of broadband will work. So behind the idea of racism is the idea that that people of different races are different versus should be treated exactly the same. Now, the frame, if you will, of racism is terrible and bad and disgusting if it means that some people.
And I think we lost him again.
Or the frame that someone who is, that people of different races are somehow.
Louise, do you want me to take over?
Yes, carry on, Viktor.
So what Ken was trying to get at, Ken, I'm taking over because you're frozen, so I don't know what's going on, but I'll continue on the framing example. So what is crucial about frames, and in the context of racism that Ken was just mentioning, is that racism, of course, is terrible. He may be back in. No, not really.
That's all right, Viktor. Carry on.
The racism frame is terrible, not necessarily because it suggests that people from different contexts and upbringings and different origins are different, but because it attaches a certain value proposition to that difference. And oftentimes we have taken that frame and contrasted it with a different frame, this time the frame of everybody being equal. Now, because we don't want to attach a value judgment to the differences. Now, the equalness has led to people denying that there exists different realities for people with different upbringings, with different origins. And people of color have actually looked at it and said that kind of color blindness, while well-meaning, is actually a bit of racist itself, because it suggests that my upbringing that was saddled with tremendous challenges because I am a member of a minority, is treated exactly and sort of compared with somebody who was white and middle class and had everything going and didn't have the challenges that I faced. And that would suggest that apples and oranges should be compared the same way. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be colorblind. In fact, we should be colorful. We should understand the differences, but not attach value propositions to it. And so what this means is that actually that frame that some associate with racism, namely to understand that people come from different origins, isn't necessarily always a bad frame if we work it the right way, and if we derive from it the right decisions and not attach some value proposition or some value judgment to it. And so in that sense, it drives forward that very important notion that there isn't necessarily a bad frame per se, with one important exception that we make in the book, but that there is a lot of bad framing. That is of taking frames and applying it for the wrong purpose to the wrong context.
Thanks, Viktor. And that's an example of being almost stuck in a frame. Another example that you gave that I really enjoyed reading was the way that you drew on Me Too as an example of a new frame of a situation. The Me Too movement is many things, but perhaps most powerfully, it is a frame. It transformed how sexual assault is perceived, not as something to be kept private, but something that could be made public. So Kenneth, maybe you'd like to jump in there and talk about that particular way of reframing something that's been around us in society for a period and then gets told in a new way that all of a sudden gets completely understood in a new way.
Yeah, I'd love to, and I hope that the connection holds. If it doesn't, for some reason, I will actually restart my computer. It'll take a couple minutes and I'll come back in, but let's see if it'll work. So one of the great things about the book is that it gave us the opportunity to talk to so many incredible people. And one of the people that we interviewed for the book was Alyssa Milano, the American actor who is responsible for creating the modern Me Too movement with the hashtag Me Too by sending out that famous tweet several years ago. And for her, it was a deliberate attempt to reframe the situation of sexual assault from one that put the emphasis on the perpetrator to putting the emphasis on the victims, and to show how widespread this issue was. And she thought about it in that very deliberate way. She was actually staring at her daughter, asking, how am I going to tell my daughter about this and discuss this with her? And what the world didn't know at the time is one of the reasons why this was so emotional for her was because there was something that was bottled up within her, which was she herself was the victim of sexual assault on a film set when she was very young, and she had never told anyone about it before. Now, she subsequently has talked about it without naming the person who did it, who is a Hollywood actor, like they all are. But in here, she was very alarmed by the way in which this was something that was kept private and focused on the perpetrator, not the victim. Now, by changing the frame, if you will, by putting the emphasis in a different direction, it showed how important it was, because it clearly tapped into something globally. People could see it, women could see it, and simply put a tweet out. They could either identify with it and add solace as the world's largest support group, or they could actually, with their voice, name what happened and the circumstance. For a lot of men, a lot of partners, as well, a lot of fathers, a lot of brothers saw this for the first time and saw how widespread it was. I think the Me Too movement is going to be almost as, it's not going to be as important as the Reformation and Martin Luther. However, for an equality among the sexes and about explaining a shared lived experience among women vis-a-vis men, it will be, I think, foundationally important in society. And it's because the frame has shifted, and we can see that how that happened and the import of that, because it tapped in to this sort of global awakening and thirst for viewing it in a different way.
Thanks, Ken. I'm going to hand over to my co-host Prakash in a minute, but just before we do, I'd just like to ask you, Viktor, to it's a very profound sentence that you finish the book with. You say we thrive through cooperation, but we can only survive as framers. would you just elaborate on what you meant by that rather profound statement, Viktor?
Absolutely, very happy to. Many of you may know the book Sapiens that Yuval Harari wrote a couple of years ago and became a world bestseller. And the book makes a number of arguments, but one central argument is that we humans got where we are because of coordination, because of how we were able to coordinate with each other. And there's clearly something to it. Coordination is incredibly important. But over the last 2 or 3 millennia, we have reaped a lot of the low-hanging fruits of coordination. And so we're pretty good at coordinating already. And yet we are facing almost existential, perhaps even very existential problems and challenges today. So how are we going to tackle those challenges? And Harari looks at it and says, through more coordination, that is more of the same. And we argue that's helpful, but it's not going to be enough. In order to tackle the challenges of today, we need to look at a different superpower that we humans possess. Not the superpower of coordinating well with each other, but of doing something before we even can coordinate, and that is human decision-making, improving human decision-making. And improving human decision-making is not about how to pick the better of 2 bad options. It is how to come up with better options to pick from. And that coming up with better options in the first place thrives and is built on our ability to frame. So framing in a way, thinking in mental models and playing around with them is the superpower that humanity has and now needs to utilize more than ever in human history in order to tackle the existential problems we face. Coordination isn't enough, framing will do it.
Thanks, Viktor. That's really great. And it draws on a section at the start of the book. And the authors say, most of our challenges are a matter of survival for individuals or communities, but not for the entire planet. So that's how things have become so much more of a challenge. I'm going to hand over to Prakash now to carry on the conversation, and then we'll be opening up for questions from the members. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise, for settling us and starting it in a beautiful way. I also want to quickly point out a couple of our members who have just joined us, I think, for the first day out here at the Behavioral Science Club. I see Ashwin, I see Dhruv, I see Gaurav has joined us. Today is the second day out here. And then there's Kirsten, there is Saloni. I think even Saloni's first time out here. Sophia too. Sunny also, right? And then Tom. So for you guys, first timers out here, you feel free to put your cameras on, go to a gallery mode, look at who are the other regulars out here, exchange your email, IDs, make new friends, because it's a club. That's the whole point of it being a club. You make new friends, professional, personal connections. Feel free to do that. Also, feel free to start typing in your questions, guys, because that helps us pick up the ones that we can, send out to Kenneth and Viktor, right? Viktor and Ken, I was listening into the conversation you earlier had with Louise, and we were talking about framing in terms of it almost being a superpower. And then in this group right now, we have students. We've got people like Christine, she has just about completed her degree and she loves the world of mental model. On the other hand, we also have got experienced professionals like Renusha and Binit, who are marketeers responsible for managing an entire portfolio of brands. And they also understand this whole beautiful world of mental models and how it can change or make their work better. So I think one of the first questions we all will be curious is, how do we harness this superpower? How do I wake up in the morning tomorrow with a new set of frames or with a new way of looking at the world, and in turn become a much more efficient, a much more successful Prakash, or a much more successful Renusha, or a much more successful Binit? Is that doable? And if so, what is the route to developing these new individual frames?
Why don't I take a first crack at it, and then I'll let Viktor pick it up. It is absolutely doable. It is absolutely doable. But there's two sort of prepositions that you need to know, or suppositions first. The first one is that you're always framing, so you don't have to wake up. Secondly, you probably don't need to reframe. You're in a frame right now. You can probably use that frame, but within that frame, there's three features that you need to be conscious of. And when you're conscious of it, you can now work within that frame to elicit different options and therefore make better decisions and get better outcomes. And these three different features are causality, counterfactuals, and constraints. Now, Viktor brought it up earlier in discussing about this remit of the mental models and how to use it as a cognitive muscle. Let me take another quick sort of stab and think about each one individually and how you would actually use it in your day-to-day life in terms of imagining all the interactions that you have and how it could actually come to bear to make you a better Prakash. So first is causality. You want to understand the cause and effect of a circumstance, of a situation that you're facing. What is the operative thing going on there? Now, humans are not good at causality. We often see it where it doesn't exist, but the fact that we think in causality, that we're primed to see causes even if they don't exist, is actually a feature. And the reason why is it makes the world not only understandable, but also actionable, that we can act within it. Okay. The first thing you would do is you look at a situation, you'd say, well, what's happening here? Like, what are the causal links, the causation that I need to be aware of? The second thing is counterfactuals, the what if questions, asking yourself, playing the game of life several steps ahead and asking not what is, but what can be. And how can you imagine different counterfactuals, different realities than the one that existed? The third one is the constraints. It's about applying boundaries and limits and adjusting them, loosening certain constraints while you tighten other constraints. And by doing so, now you're acting within a frame, but you're now able to adjust it and come up with maybe see alternatives that you hadn't imagined before, and thereby increase the range of options that you can choose from and maybe make a better decision. So there's lots of different ways that can be applied. Why don't I stop there and let Viktor take it on, or you can ask a follow-up question if you like.
Why don't you ask a follow-up question? I think Ken was very eloquent.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, Ken, for that. The follow-up question, Viktor and Ken, would be, so there is me as the individual, we as the individual, and the society as the whole, right? You're talking about me too. It was not there. And then suddenly it was there. And we all realize, this is a big problem. And that framing helps us understand those two words, me too. I've been through this also. What is this process, or have you done this research? How does a new frame or a new way of looking, at the same old, it's almost like a meme has got popular. But what is I don't mean to make it frivolous, but I couldn't think of a better example. I'm sorry with that word of meme, but how does it become dominant?
Prakash, if I may jump in here, the question isn't whether it's becoming dominant or not, because domination is actually a bad thing. We want to have a lot of variety in the frames that we have in our repertoires, but how it becomes a part of our repertoire. And of course, the most obvious thing is to take a frame and to add it to one's repertoire, to actively pursue that. And we're doing that in a way. If you think about business schools and the case study method in the business schools, that is trying to teach frames to students that add that to their repertoire, to their respective repertoires. But then we can go beyond that and prepare ourselves to be open-minded. So when we encounter a new frame, or when we need to look for a new frame, we know how to look, not where exactly to look, not taking it out of the library, so to speak, but how to look for it. In the book, we call that cognitive foraging, this ability to sort of have a freer mind. And what is really interesting is that we give a lot of examples for it. One example that comes to mind here is Jennifer Doudna, one of the two female researchers that came up with the CRISPR gene sequencing or gene scissor for gene editing. She wasn't the one who actually saw it or did it for the first time. It was a lab assistant of hers, but he didn't have a clue of what he was doing. He was just doing it. And she looked at it and she was obviously in the right mental state. She was ready as a cognitive forager to see beyond the immediate, beyond the actual, towards the general, the more abstract, to create kind of a frame out of it. And she looked at it and said, shoot, this is really profound. I know what to do with it. This is like a scissor to do gene editing. This isn't just a chemical process. We can actually harness this. This is a tool rather than just a reaction. And she said in an interview that her hair stood up in the back because she, in an instant, realized how powerful that was. And as we explain these examples, and we do global warming, we do nuclear fission, what is really interesting is, as we went into this, we discovered that there is a lot of women who are actually capable of doing that, far more often than men. So it seems like there is a perhaps unique trait, a unique quality of cognitive foraging that is there. This might link back to the Me Too movement in a way, but it is an amazing ability to go from the particular and the specific to the general and abstract, and then create a tool that is not wedded to a particular context, but that can be generalized and abstracted and therefore attains an incredible amount of value and power.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so torn right now between where do I get my next question from? Because, this fantastic idea of constraints. And we had Professor Larry Klodge from University of Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, just few days back with his book Subtract, which is all about not adding, but subtract. And then it gives you a better way of looking at it. And it's apt because for most of us, the way we look at the world is, if only I had more money, more power, more friends, more, more budget to do things, I would have been able to get something done. And the idea that you can actually use a constraint to free yourself and reframe things, it almost seems amazing. I mean, get more done with less resources. But on the other side, there's this question of the title of the book itself about technology. And so I want to, I think, possibly explore that as one last question, then we shall open it up for Q&A. The question, I think, is around as technology evolves, and now, we have algorithms that can teach themselves, newer algorithms that can learn newer patterns of data. In a way, they can teach themselves mental models. And they're at a certain level of evolution right now, and they are going to go toward a certain level of evolution in the future. So with that being the direction of progress technologically, and when you look at the way we use, for example, something like social media, right? So what kind of mental models or frames are going to be developing among us around the usage of technology, social media, disinformation, and what does that route lead us to? Is it a Terminator world at the end of it, or are we looking at a Star Trek future? Viktor and Ken.
Viktor, do you want to? I will take one small stab at that. It's a vast question, and it's something that you said almost in passing, which is that we have these algorithms and that they are able to generate mental models. And actually, I would stop you there and say, well, actually, no, they can't. And that's a very fundamental aspect of understanding artificial intelligence and understanding human cognition. AI cannot generate frames. They cannot abstract. They cannot generate representations. The whole point of framing or having a mental model is being able to generate a representation of reality and abstraction that you can transfer and use in a variety of settings. Now, artificial intelligence algorithms do not have that. They can't have that. Insofar as if they were to have it, I shouldn't say that they can't have it, they can't generate it on their own. They will be imbued with the mental model of the designer of the algorithm and the curator of the data and the researcher who's put the two together for a given purpose. But on their own, they simply cannot do it. And I'll simply point out one reason why, although there's many, and the book has an exhaustive argument on that, and it's the issue of counterfactuals. The way that an AI algorithm works today is that, and we're talking really deep learning, machine learning. We could talk about the traditional forms of AI, but that is even an easier case to talk about. Let's look at deep learning. It relies on data. The data is inherently that which exists, whereas the whole point about counterfactual reasoning and the human beings is it's inherently that which does not exist. It's something that we can only envision, that we see with the mind's eye, that it's not actually instantiated in any way. This is completely fundamental. Now, to a scientist, starting with Galileo onwards, this is trivial. Of course, you have to generate a representation or an abstraction of that which you're examining, which has never existed before. So you generate this hypothesis of how the world works and then you test it. But in this rarefied area of high-end science, people are aware of their mental models. For the rest of us, for the 99%, they've never thought a whit about the fact that we think in mental models and in frames, and that we can adjust our frame and that we can reframe or change our frames. That's the key message of the book, right? That suddenly we're empowering people with a tool that humans are already able to do, but artificial intelligence and algorithms that simply rely on data inherently cannot do, because we can actually play with our mental models, adapt it to the situation that we need to improve our outcomes.
Can I just add with an example here? Kathleen pointed out in the chat that AI can be biased because of the data that gets fed in. And in the best kind of possible world, AI is reflecting reality. But what our mind can do is, as Ken just said, imagine a reality that's different. Not a reality in which somebody violated the law and had to go to prison, but in which that person comes out of prison reformed and is not going to re-offend anymore. That is an imagined reality. It's not there yet, but we can hopefully make it happen. All of our hopes for the future are built on our ability to shape reality and to change reality to an extent. Think about global warming. A lot of people think that the hockey stick graph that Al Gore trumps around is the proof that there is global warming and it's caused by humans. It only shows that there is global warming, but it doesn't show that we humans are the cause of it. How do we know that humans are the cause of it? Not through the data directly, but by imagining a world that is like ours, but just doesn't have humans in it. And then we calculate that world, we run the model of that world with all of the parameters and all the laws of physics and biology and chemistry. And we realize temperature doesn't rise in that world, but it does rise in ours. It's an A/B test, but not of two actual worlds, but one imagined one. That's the kind of thing that Ken mentioned, not that exists, but that it doesn't exist, that we humans bring to the table of evolution.
Thanks so much, Victor, for that. And Ken, my conceptions are clear now, better now. Thank you for correcting me with that mistake which I had. I was under the impression that an algorithm can teach itself beyond a point. So thank you for that correction. Louise, I want to invite you in. Please help me with the Q&As now.
Thanks so much, Prakash. And this is one of these talks where it's just sparking off so many thoughts in my mind. I'm thinking of the talk that we had from Bijou Dominic for other members. He talks about mental models. This is very relevant to today's conversation. I'm recommending Catch and Kill, the brilliant book by Ronan Farrow, and his podcast, which is about Me Too, as Ken and Victor were talking about. I'm thinking of the Coded Bias documentary on Netflix when we're talking about biased AI, fantastic documentary. And also people interested in this subject reading about the memory. People who have been studied who have impaired memory can't imagine into the future. And that's so essential in this particular idea that we're talking about. So I'd like to bring in Priyanka. Priyanka had a question a little way back, and I think it's when we were talking about the model, the racism model. Priyanka, would you like to join us? You were talking about attaching positive models to difference.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I don't know how much of it was a question or like a thought that ran by my head when you spoke about that, about the concept of removing value in the concept of making everyone equal, but that actually backfired. So I was wondering, so instead of doing that, how could we possibly attach positive value to difference while acknowledging the human in each of us? But going forward from that, like the thought sort of trailed off, not written on the chat, but I'll ask you now that I have a chance. Thanks, Louise. When you were speaking of Me Too, I know there was a second order effect to Me Too as well. While it was wonderful and it gave everyone a platform to go out there, I worked in mental health as well and worked with people who've been through assault. Quite often, it's a life-changing event. It gives you PTSD. It changes the way you trigger, the way you associate with other human beings as well. And quite often you do keep it private, but like everyone taking it out there, it almost similar to the case of racism, it nullified the value because everyone's been through it. Like, especially in India as well, you often, like if you're a woman and you've had an incident, you're often told everyone goes through it. Why are you complaining about it? So, you know, there was that. And there was also, like, I know of stories of men who've been through assault, and if they acknowledged it, they were bullied. Why are you lying? This only happens to women. And so, yeah, again, like, how do we do positive value? And a third thing, in mental health now, there's often the whole thing that reframe your story, reframe it with a positive lens, and you'll start healing. But quite often that again nullifies the actual event. So how do you, I mean, I know this is like more like rather than like situations like an interview, reframe it as a partnership, you'll do better in the interview. It's not that. These are more intense moments, but how would reframing work here? How would that positive value without removing the intensity of the incidents or acknowledging of the human go away? I guess, yeah, going through all of that, that's the question.
Why don't I start off, and Ken, you, Jim, chime in. First of all, let's make clear that we are not investigating or defending or examining the Me Too movement, but using it as an example for human frames. So all these questions that you pose, Priyanka, are very important questions to which I have no answer or no easy answer, because that would require separate studies and important ones. And I hope that they are getting done because they need to be done. What though is important in the last question that you asked about the sort of positive framing is what shines through there is that there is an attempt to normalize and to push people into a particular frame and to say, you need to have a positive frame. You know, why don't you think this positively? As if there was an immediate and general advantage of a frame compared to other frames. And we make the argument in the book that that actually isn't the case. That in fact, there is only good framing or bad framing, but for the most part, not good or bad frames. The one exception we make, and we haven't talked very much about it, but your question gives me the opportunity to do that, is we make the point that there is one kind of bad frame, and it is the frame that denies the existence of other frames. So if there is this frame that says, I am the single frame of truth, I am the one and only frame to look and understand the world, then we need to be incredibly cautious about this particular frame, lest it takes over and pushes all the other frames to the side, because that immediately takes the variety and the diversity out of the frames we have in our individual minds and in society, available to society to tackle the challenges we face. And we need to be very careful about that.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. Deep questions there. Thank you so much, as usual. Always bring along great questions. I'd like to bring in Kathleen now, who has read the books. Kathleen, would you like to address your question to Ken and Viktor, please?
Different cover, same book. And also, I read it this week, and at the same time, I read Think Again by Adam Grant. These books go together. So those of you who haven't read this yet, you also need to read this book. This is an idea whose time has come. I mean, it's always been there, but different. They base you. So, I mean, I was like, yeah, yeah, you know, they overlap really well. So that's my point there. A lot of stuff in here, and we've been discussing, I found very useful. I wrote an article some time ago, many years ago, called Reframing, about trying to refocus how we look at certain health issues. So I like that concept. I did have some quibbles, and as everyone knows, when I read something, I find quibbles, but your chapter on learning and the chapter on pluralism feel like they were written by different people. And since there's 3 authors, I think that is quite possible. The chapter on learning starts out very quickly talking about, we don't care about fluffy diversity. So I would like to know, what do you mean by fluffy diversity? Because the chapter on pluralism seems to not agree with how I interpreted fluffy diversity. And then I have a follow-up.
Absolutely, Kathleen. I can answer that very quickly. What we meant with fluffy diversity is the sort of argument that we need diversity because it's the ethically right thing to do. The argument that we drive in the book is that diverse thinking, cognitive diversity, is not a goal, but is a means to a better goal, to a better decision making. So we see it as a tool, and therefore it is not just sort of something that makes us feel good, but that actually makes us make better decisions.
Okay,
I would add one other thing to it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which is, often diversity, at least in the American context, is tokenism. And what we're referring to actually is legitimate, authentic diversity. When we say pluralism, it is actually not just simply a box ticking exercise or tokenism, but actually really striving for a legitimate, pluralistic tolerance and actually embrace of the many.
Okay. Well, this brings me to some of my concerns with your explanation on, because that's kind of what I thought you meant by fluffy diversity. So you also, then you go and use Apple, the Apple company, as an example of doing diversity right. And yet it seems to me that what you are saying, and there's another point I can find a little further, and I took notes. In my notes is that you really feel like white men can express these forms of diversity, and you don't need women, and you don't need other people of color. Apple is 66% male. These are the new stats, 66% male and 47% white. And to use them as an example that is showing really good framing. Have you read Invisible Women by Carolyn Criado Perez? I think she would say Apple is not doing that good a job. The other thing is that you ding Norway for doing what I think you call, oh, good, I'm glad to see that, what you call fluffy diversity by just adding some women to their boards, and it didn't work well, which, you know, true. If you just add random people, it's not going to work well. But then you say, but there were teams for women. They did other research, because I am familiar with this. And they did have the women with teams with women, particularly in management, did seem to do better because of their more pro-social behaviors, but men could learn to do this too, which I agree, but it really comes across in the learning chapter. White men can do everything, and we don't really need more diversity in that. And then I get to the pluralism chapter, and that seems much better. That's just my point, is I was a little bothered by that, because I think you make so many good points in there. And this just,
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen, and we certainly take that to heart. Let me just clarify a couple of things here. One is the learning chapter and the diversity chapter were written by all three of us. They were not written by different people. Secondly, oftentimes it comes down to a baseline question. What is your baseline? What are you comparing it against? And when you look at the high-tech industry, then within the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley, Apple and big tech in particular, Apple actually, relatively speaking, is doing better than others and has been trying to do more in the last couple of years than they have done before. That doesn't mean that they are the champions of diversity. In fact, what we're using them is not Apple itself as an example, but the Apple University that was instituted or started, if you want, originated by the late Steve Jobs. And the idea was there to make sure that diverse thinking becomes a key feature of Apple's culture. And he was very worried about that. But we are, I think, in the book, never making the argument that Apple actually is the most diverse company out there, because that would simply be wrong.
I didn't think you meant that. What I thought you meant, and I do think you mean this, is that anybody can learn diverse thinking, and it does not require that you actually have diverse physical people, like we can see in our gallery view right here. And that in these companies, even if they are majority white male, they can still have all of these diverse frameworks that they work from. And I'm saying no.
and we are saying no too. In fact, in the learning
the
chapter,
pluralism chapter made me feel better. I have to say that. The pluralism chapter made me feel better.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, but we are, I think, very deliberate in the learning chapter, saying that the best proxy, or a very good proxy to cognitive diversity, is actual diversity out there. And we make the argument about diverse teams and how to harness the power of diverse teams. There's actually an interesting wrinkle there. But we're very explicit that this the best way to bring cognitive diversity to the table in large organizations is through actual diversity of the people involved. And that goes beyond just the gender or the sex of the people. That's why we are introducing the Norway example. The Norway example is about women and a law or a regulation in Norway that forced companies to add women to their boards for those companies that haven't already done so. And the problem was that this was only partially successful, in part because a lot of the women that were added to the boards by those laggard companies, very conservative or conventional companies, were actually always the same women that had been educated and come from the cultural backgrounds that are relatively similar to their male counterparts. So in fact, what we're saying there is, if you want real diversity, you need to go beyond that gender diversity and look for people of color, look for people of different socioeconomic backgrounds. So we're actually pushing your point that you're so vividly making even further. That's the entire reasoning for the Norway example.
Yeah,
And
Kenneth,
we
do you want
but
to
that
join
was
us?
a pluralism chapter.
Sorry, Kathleen. I think Kenneth has something he's aching to tell us.
Yes,
Okay.
and we even pushed that very point in the chapter that you find questionable learning on page 162, and I think the additions are the same with the pagination. I will quote from it. How can organizations protect mental diversity among their members and even increase it? It seems impossible, since one cannot peek into another human's mind for sure. Yet, even if the trait cannot be directly observed, organizations can identify suitable proxies. And the most obvious proxy for mental diversity is social diversity. It is clear that individuals with similar upbringings, educational backgrounds, and professional expertise are prone to think alike. In contrast, individuals from vastly different ethnicities, socio-demographic groups, and educations have divergent life experiences, which in turn likely translate into dissimilar mental models of the world. Bringing together a diverse group of people can maximize an organization's cognitive resources.
Thanks, Kenneth, and thank you, Kathleen. Never shy here to put our authors on the spot. And we're getting close to time now, but I would like to bring in a question from Arvind, if you're still with us, Arvind. And I like this question because in the book, you do talk about the incident, the Bataclan incident, and Arvind had a question about 9/11.
Yeah, so this follows from your conversation with George Harman. And, you guys had a very illustrative and very entertaining conversation with him. So my question was that, at least from what I gathered, was the 9/11 was a reframing of the airfare, terrorism of sorts. So I wanted to understand in terms of reframing for good and bad, especially when there are algorithms being written, machine learning and whatnot. How does reframing play for good and bad? So I wanted your take on it.
So if you're a terrorist and you want to create maximum damage, you have to think about how to do that and what the options are, then good framing actually helps you to become a better terrorist. Sorry to say that, but that's precisely what the thinking was. And 9/11, in my mind, wasn't so much about reframing than about looking at the existing frame of airplane safety or air flight safety and looking at the constraints and how you can wiggle the constraints. Because of course, what has always been assumed was that that hijackers would want some ransom money or somebody being freed from prison that was a member of their cause somewhere. And the idea was you land the airplane and then you start negotiations. And therefore, all of the decisions in the cockpit and so forth were geared towards getting the airplane safely to land and then start the negotiations. What they didn't understand was that you could also have a very different, that this wasn't a constraint in the terrorist. There could be a terrorist whose constraint wasn't to save his or her life, but to actually afflict maximum damage. So loosening that life-saving constraint and therefore basically killing the pilot or taking over the airplane and crashing it into something, that made for a, if you want, better decision for a better terrorist in the sense of inflicting maximum damage. And as a tool, as a cognitive tool, of course, it can be used for whatever purpose you want to use it.
It's just on the follow-up, because using aircraft to do maximized damage was not a novel or a unique thing pertaining, because harakiri, or the entire concept of Japanese warplanes crashing in with the pilots once the plane has been shot down, was already existing. So I'm not sure if it's not the case of reframing, or is it just viewing the problem?
You could argue, people can argue, was 9/11 about reframing terrorism, or was, as Viktor says, just simply staying within the frame and simply adjusting different constraints. It is true that there were kamikazes before, but they were the sole person in the plane, and it's a terrible story of the crew members filling up the tanks of the plane that had explosives in it with only half the amount of fuel, so that they couldn't actually make a return whatsoever. So you knew what you were doing when you were going off, and there was a whole ritual around it. But in the case of 9/11, it is true that planes had not been used as missiles before, and here that they were. But there, as Viktor pointed out, the shock to the West was that the entire edifice of airline safety was found wanting. As example, you look at the luggage to find out that you try to match the luggage with the person to make sure that the person is on the plane with the luggage, which actually is so nonsensical, right? Is useless, because of course the person is, in this instance, a suicide mission. And then secondly, as Viktor said, all of the work in the cockpit was land the plane safely, begin the negotiation, not thinking that in fact they would take over the plane and then not fly to land, but fly to inflict damage. Sadly, that the framing, like all cognitive features, is going to be used for good and for bad, and we can hope that actually those of us of better will can sort of make the case for a better society.
Thank you so much. Great question, Arvind. We are out of time, but I do want to just ask one more question, because framing is seeing the world as it can be. And Lashazar, I won't bring you in to ask this, but Lashazar had asked a question: can you make someone adopt your mental model? And I think that would be a great question to finish on, if you don't mind. Just
thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, Lashazar, it was a great question.
Hi Ken, hi Viktor, hi everyone. My name is Lachizar and I'm a PhD candidate in Germany. I apply frameworks from behavioral biology to marketing and advertising. So yeah, Luis already read out my question, but I want to specify some further points. Like 2 days ago, I watched the documentary on WeWork, and it was fascinating. And one of the reasons is that I am very much interested in the topic of real estate, but it's also true that you can't build anything that's worth so much without tapping into human nature, I think. So I was wondering, how did this guy, Adam Newman, was able to convince so many people that subleasing big places and subrenting it into small units is of so much value. So hence my question: how can you convince someone else to adopt your model and your frame of the world?
Viktor, do you want to start? Well, I'll start and then you take it on. We invoked Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens* before to talk about cooperation. I'll invoke it again in terms of another aphorism that Harari has mentioned. He says that that the story, that the 21st century will belong to the storyteller, and that narratives are so important. And in Silicon Valley, as you know, when you're raising capital, they talk about what is your story, your origin myth. And so in the case of WeWork, he did actually have to set out a frame and try to communicate that frame to people. And that frame was that by having real estate and parceling it out, that it wasn't just simply a real estate play, it was a social media play. because you had these companies there, they could talk to each other, they could commingle, and if you lost your job with one company at a WeWork, they would actually endeavor to get you to another startup there at a time when everyone is looking for talent, that you'd be fungible. So they were trying to make it into almost like a physical social network, rather than, and therefore have the high valuation of a tech company, for so to speak, than just simply a subleased real estate play. But your point is actually, can you communicate can you get people to buy into your frames? And the answer is, if it was that easy, we would be manipulating people a lot more. The fact is, we can do that. Political candidates are in the business of trying to set out a frame and get people to adhere to it. I think we've been surprised at how vulnerable we are, that in the case of the United States, so many people believe one thing about Trump and the election versus others. So that's a little bit frightening, but at the same time, it's not all of the Republican Party. And so the role of the storyteller and the role of narrative is going to be critical as a way of communicating frames, but it's not easy to actually get people to change it. And certainly if you're, as we know, trying to talk to people with our family members who might see things differently, not only agree with us or disagree with us, but just see fundamental aspects of the world differently, how effective is it at family dinner tables to get other people to buy into your frames? Well, probably not as easy as you wish.
Thank you. Great question, Lashizar. And this has been a really cerebral session. I think we've really picked each other's brains and could be talking about this for a lot longer, but we have to wrap up the event. And so thank you so much, Viktor. Thank you so much, Kenneth. It's just been great fun listening to you, responding to our questions. And I'm just going to hand back to Prakash now to wrap up the event.
Thank you so much, Louise, Ken, and Viktor. Wow. Thank you so much. You guys are really awesome. Like I told you, we have all kind of questions saying, what's the name of your book? To like 20, really hardcore question on your book. The range is quite diverse, and thank you for taking them all and giving us your time. I saw one comment out there in the chat box around 72 virgins and that kind of being, one of the explanation to us why we have terrorism. I just want to touch it just for like 2 seconds and then we'll say advice, because we're talking about framing. I think we obsess a lot about that part, about the virgins and afterlife and all. From our frame, when we're trying to understand these people who take up these kind of causes. In reality, the number of people who are being motivated to do something, how many of them are looking, saying, in my afterlife, I'm going to have this many virgins or this many happy men, whatever it is. I think they're the frame with which they think is more around their life. They have got either grievances or their life is really miserable. There's nothing else. And this is the one thing they can do. I just want to touch that. I think that's the frame with which they look at it. But now back to Viktor and Ken. Guys, before you go, and again, like I told you, we are students here, we are marketeers here, we are product managers and entrepreneurs out here. And with each session that we do, we want to enrich our life. So what is the one thing that we guys can do? If you can leave us with one sentence, one tip, how can we get better at framing? I know the first answer is buy my book, which we will. But before you go, is there one thing you can leave us with?
Never see the world as it is, but what it can be.
Thank you so much. I saw your book started with something about light. For there is always light. If only we were brave enough to see it. If only we were brave enough to be it. Thank you so much, Viktor and Ken. Wonderful time here. Everyone else out here, thank you so much. Stay safe, wear your mask.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Great talk. Thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined us, and see you next week.